Welcome back to Unknown Fantasy Origins, the show where we explore the backstories behind concepts seen in TV, film, and gaming. Viewer discretion is advised. Stories from the real world are more disturbing than they appear on TV. In the previous episode of UFO, I talked about real-life stories portrayed on the popular TV show American Horror Story Season 2. In this episode, we're going to take a look at Season 3, Coven. Coven is placed in present-day New Orleans, and one of the characters showcased is played by Kathy Bates. That character was Madame Delphine Lalaurie. The character is viewed in one way as the horrifying serial killer through flashbacks, and the other as comedic relief as she adjusts to the current ways of the modern world. While Bates received an acting nomination for the role, most people didn't realize this story was real. Madame Lalaurie was a real woman, and her story is even creepier than the one we saw on the show. So let's take a look at the real character of Madame Delphine Lalaurie. In the 19th century, if you lived in and around the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, you already knew who Madame Delphine Lalaurie was. She, with her husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, were essentially the life of the party. Their mansion was in the center of downtown, and by owning an insane amount of money, they could show off their wealth by spending it on extravagant parties they held several nights a week. These parties drew people in from all over to attend. But Delphine didn't always live this way. Delphine was one of 5 children, her father bringing his family to New Orleans from Ireland. Delphine would marry her first husband in June of 1800, who was a high-ranking officer in Spain. On a trip together to Spain, she gave birth to her daughter. Her husband never made it to Spain, and Delphine, with her daughter, returned to New Orleans. 4 years later, Delphine married her second husband, who was a banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. They purchased a house at 409 Royal Street, now known as Villa Blanc. Here she had 4 more children. 9 years later, she married the dear doctor despite being older than him, and bought the property at 1140 Royal Street. She managed it on her own, building the 3-story mansion with attached slave quarters. Her husband and 2 of her daughters moved in with her, and they built their reputation among the social circles in New Orleans. Accounts from the times between 1831 and 1834 about how she treated her slaves are mixed. On one hand, in public, Delphine was polite, cared about their health, and there are even records of her emancipating 2 of her slaves. Rumors around town led a local lawyer to her mansion to remind Delphine of the laws for keeping slaves. He saw nothing wrong. However, the residents had something else to say. One of her neighbors recanted a horrific tale. Leah, a 12-year-old slave, was brushing Delphine's hair and hit a snag. Delphine's temper broke free and caused her to grab and whip and chase the young girl. Terrified, the girl ran the 3 stories up to the roof and found herself on the ledge. She flung herself off to avoid what Delphine could subject her to. The girl was quietly buried on the property. After witnessing this, an investigation soon began into the illegal cruelty of the slaves. And in the end, the Lalauries had to forfeit 9 slaves, which they later bought back by having their relatives purchase them instead. April 10th, 1834, the fire started. It happened to start in the kitchen. Police and fire marshals discovered a 70-year-old woman chained to the stove. Stories say Lalaurie kept the woman, the cook, always chained to the stove and would actually beat her own daughters if they tried to give her food. The fire turned out to have been set by that old woman in an attempt to commit suicide. She feared punishment, to be taken to that uppermost room where anyone who had been taken there never came back. The paper described bystanders trying to check that the slave quarters were empty. The Lalauries refused to hand over the keys. They only cared about their valuables. Desperate, people broke through the doors to find 7 mutilated slaves, suspended by their neck, their limbs stretched and even torn from one extremity to the other. They were there for months. One woman was in an iron collar. Another older woman had such a deep head wound she couldn't even walk. Some reported that they were whipped, starved, and wore spikes that held their heads in static positions. When asked about the slaves, Dr. Lalaurie said, "Some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business." The public didn't agree. Word spread and a mob formed and set to destroy everything in the mansion they could reach. The slaves were taken to a local jail where they could be viewed. 4,000 people showed up to see if the rumors were really true. Unfortunately, 2 slaves died shortly after their rescue, and several more bodies were found on the grounds. Delphine Lalaurie escaped the mob. It's hazy where she immediately fled. People were saying she died in 1888 in France, but it wasn't until 1924 did we have any proof of where she went. A man working as a sexton in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 found an old cracked copper plate in Alley 4. It read, "Madame Lalaurie died in Paris, December 12, 1842. If that date is correct, she only died 8 years after the fire. Years passed and the stories began to evolve. Some would research and interview residents from the area, while others would reprint stories with extra details added to the mix. After 1945, the stories were explicit. Lalaurie had obtained this sadistic appetite that could not be filled unless she was torturing someone. People had now witnessed naked male slaves with their eyes gouged out, fingernails ripped off, skinned body parts, holes in their bodies, ears hanging off, and lips sewn together. Even their intestines ripped out and knotted around their waist. Some even said she had put holes in their skull and stirred their brains around with a stick. These reports cited no sources at all. The most famous embellishment mentioned a girl who had her arms amputated and her skin peeled in a circular pattern like a human caterpillar, or the girl with her limbs broken and reset at weird angles looking like a human crab. These had no sources, or the sources did not support what was said. The mansion remains a wreck to this day, perhaps out of fear? Despite being destroyed, it was restored in 1888. It was used as a high school, music conservatory, tenement, refuge, bar, furniture store, and even luxury apartments. The ownership has passed hands several times over the years, leading people to believe that the place is cursed. Actor Nicolas Cage most recently bought the mansion for $3.5 million in 2007. He had to sell it only 2 years later for bank foreclosure for a little more than $2 million. Witnesses claim that the grounds are haunted by the slaves who have been tortured there. But not everyone believes Lalaurie is evil. In fact, the president of the board of curators for the Louisiana State Museum believes she's innocent. He looks at the public records about Lalaurie and believes that people were jealous of her stature. A local woman also agrees. Her husband, being the 5th descendant of Lalaurie, she plans to look through the records for any answers. So, do you believe that jealousy could have caused such a tale to be formed? Do you believe what the residents saw in the attic that day? Or do you think we could be trying to exonerate one of America's most horrifying serial killers? Whether you believe or not is up to you. Whether you learned something today is up to me. Please stay tuned for the next episode of Unknown Fantasy Origins. My name is Christy A. Bell, and this is American Horror Stories Season 3. Just remember, your life can change overnight, or in a moment.